So one criticism I hear a lot is, CityNerd, you're always telling me all the ways freeways are terrible for cities, but you never tell me what to do about it. So today I'm taking you to Minneapolis-St. Paul, where I am going to enumerate all the evils of Interstate 94, but I'm also going to tell you about the amazing livable streets advocacy work that might just lead to some big changes for the better. What's going on in Minneapolis-St. Paul is honestly pretty invigorating and inspiring, and I'm going to break it all down coming up next. This is CityNerd, weekly content on cities and transportation. Viewer-suggested topics always welcome, and I've been hearing all about I-94 from my Twin Cities viewers basically since I started the channel, so now it's time. Usual disclaimer, local history and politics are inextricable from the stuff I talk about, and when I visit a city, I don't pretend to be an expert on those nuances, but what I do try to do is give you my perspective as someone with a couple decades experience working in the planning and engineering realm. So today we're focused on I-94, specifically the segment between downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul, and what you're going to see today is that there are very good reasons why I-94 appears on the Congress for the New Urbanism's 2023 Freeways Without Futures list. And just being honest, I'm not a huge fan of the idea that there are only 10 urban freeways in the US that don't have futures, because I think that number is orders of magnitude too small, but I guess you pick your battles, and in the Twin Cities, the battle is very much underway. By the way, I am going to rely on this excellent animation of the destruction caused by I-94 as we talk about the different neighborhoods in its path, because I went to basically all of them so that you could experience what the freeway is like up close, see what the remnants of these neighborhoods look like, and really feel the sense of disconnection and disruption of communities that used to be vibrant people places and could be again in the future. In other words, I spent multiple days breathing in carcinogens, microplastics, and noxious fumes, so you don't have to. Anyway, Segregation by Design does amazing work, and you can find out more about their work down in the description. We're going to go west to east, starting in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood just south of downtown Minneapolis. Cedar Riverside has a fascinating history. It has pretty consistently been a magnet for immigrants since the late 19th century, and it was a hub for the countercultural movements of the 1960s, when the area was being ravaged by construction of I-94 as well as quote-unquote slum clearance and development of large-scale housing projects. Even today, Cedar Riverside continues to draw new waves of immigrants, and some of the original urban fabric is still intact, despite decades of urban renewal, which is always a euphemism for something much more unsavory. But you can really see the original pieces of the neighborhood and imagine how powerful it could be to stitch it all back together. Keep in mind, we're looking at a freeway that was constructed when nearly all urban freeways were constructed over a period of 3 decades or so of the 20th century. Something like I-94 reflects what is, and this is just one YouTuber's opinion, an extremely outdated vision of what a city is and what a city should be. At the time it was built, freeways were considered ways to quote-unquote clean up blighted communities and create corridors of uninterrupted flow travel so people from clean, non-blighted suburban communities could travel at high speed to their jobs downtown, drive right into parking garages, and, in Minneapolis anyway, traverse the city one floor up at a safe distance from the undesirable downtown street environment. I feel like we know better today, but I guess it remains to be seen. Let's move west from Cedar Riverside, across the Mississippi River to the East Bank, but we are still in Minneapolis for a bit longer. This is what I believe is the Prospect Park neighborhood, and there are spots where you've got some dense housing infill, but nothing in this neighborhood is too far from the lovely sounds, smells, and airborne toxins of I-94. Honestly, a pretty attractive neighborhood with nice old houses, some with panoramic views of 8-lane freeways. Could you even imagine trying to build something like this today if it wasn't built already? Just total nonsense. Here's the absolute worst. It's the Malcolm Lilly House, which is commonly considered to be the first in Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian series. The Usonians were modestly sized houses he designed for middle-income families, and even if you are not yourself an architecture buff, these are amazing. Tour one if you can. Anyway, I believe the original neighborhood context was that it was at the end of a street on a bluff with railroad tracks below, but the Malcolm Lilly House now has a beautiful view of a freeway sound wall. These sound walls are backdrops to everything here. community gardens. I guess I applaud the effort, but knowing what I know about airborne particles and chemicals this close to a freeway, I don't know if I want to eat anything that came out of that soil. Children's playgrounds hemmed in by freeway sound walls, on the other hand, totally cool. Here's the thing though, the state DOT has undertaken an effort called Rethinking I-94, which acknowledges the devastation to communities and the built environment that construction of the freeway caused 60 years ago and which has been ongoing to this day. And what seems to be driving this effort is 60 years on, the pavement, bridges, and retaining walls are reaching the end of their useful lives and the DOT needs to decide what to rebuild in its place, which could be basically the same thing, or something much worse, or possibly something much better. And this is why this is such a great case study. I-94 is similar to so many urban freeways in the US built in the same era. They're all nearing the end of their useful lives in terms of structural integrity. So the real question is, have they reached the end of their useful lives in terms of reflecting what we actually want in our cities? I have my own answer to that question, but the good news is our federally mandated environmental processes really require that the state DOT ask this question, and we're in the middle of a long public engagement period where people get to weigh in on what alternatives are going to be studied in the formal EIS process. And I am going to come back to this because this really is what this video is all about. Okay, let's cross the city limits into St. Paul, into the South St. Anthony Park neighborhood, which is partly residential, partly industrial, including what's probably the only kind of operation that's really appropriate for a freeway-adjacent land use. I think it's important to acknowledge that cities aren't frozen in amber. They do evolve over time, and communities that were dominated by heavy industry decades or even a century ago aren't going to have the same function in 2024. The world is just a different place. The question is, what kind of urban design, connectivity, and transportation environment is going to be more conducive to the kind of maker spaces and small business incubators that the city is envisioning for this area? The Green Line has already begun to transform the north side of South St. Anthony Park, and there's just massive potential to transform the south side. Just a shocking amount of space dedicated to the least efficient mode of transportation we've ever devised. Moving east, the Merriam Park neighborhood on the south side of I-94, and yeah, it's a literal park right on the freeway. Ran out of money for sound walls, I assume. Let's talk a bit more about connectivity. It's just one aspect of what makes urban freeways such a terrible idea, but it's a super important one. Federal Highways actually strongly prefers that urban interchanges be spaced at least a mile apart, which makes some logical sense in terms of traffic operations and safety, because the dynamics and speed differentials involved in merging and weaving between on-ramps and off-ramps. But a mile apart between crossing opportunities for people walking and rolling is, of course, absolutely insane. So where there aren't other roadway overcrossings or undercrossings, we get whatever the state DOT decided was a cool design for a pedestrian bridge. Now, some of these can be more aesthetically pleasing than others, but I kind of prefer the ones that have a prison yard feel to them. I mean, why try to sugarcoat the fact that, as someone trying to walk or bike in your city, you're in not only the most unpleasant place possible, but almost certainly the unhealthiest. You should want to spend as little time here as possible, so don't bother trying to make it pretty. I mean, this is what we're doing to city dwellers. People like to go for runs. We put freeways right in the middle of our cities where they're almost impossible to avoid. So we've got people doing cardio and maximizing their aerobic activity and air intake in the worst possible place where anyone would want to do that. Let's go to Midway, which I think is literally midway between downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul. And this is where you can really see what's developing in St. Paul and how much potential there is to try to build on it by transforming the I-94 right away. There's already a lot of density going in the rapidly transforming district around Allianz Field. Metro Transit's A-Line BRT is right here on Snelling Avenue. The Green Line is up on University on the north side of the stadium. And the Loons do encourage you to bike on game day, so there's a lot happening in Midway that really depends on fostering transportation choices. So it's just ironic that the entire south side of the district is hemmed in by around 300 feet of right-of-way that's prohibited for use by all all but one transportation choice. Someone actually made a graphic showing how many Allianz fields you could fit into the I-94 right-of-way, which is not my preferred alternative. I mean, I'd mix in a few ballparks and hockey arenas, but point taken. Further east, Lexington Hamline, more density right at the edge of I-94, which, given everything we know about the health impacts of particulate matter, noxious chemicals, and freeway noise, is of course exactly where you want large numbers of people to be living, working, and playing. Okay, in a minute I'm going to get to what I think is the absolute most offensive part of I-94, but also I'm going to talk about all the amazing advocacy work that's happening around not only the rethinking I-94 process, but other big transportation issues in the Twin Cities as well. And I think there's a lot that other cities around the US can learn. And this is usually the point in the video where I strongly encourage you to click on stuff, but today I really just want to focus on the Twin Cities. The thing I was actually in town for was a session I was doing at the National Planning Conference, and that was great. And thanks to all the planners who came out for that. But even better, I got to do a Friday night event with Our Streets Minneapolis and several other local advocacy groups at Venture Bikes on the Midtown Greenway, right in the heart of Minneapolis. And I'm going to talk more about Our Streets in a bit because that organization is at the crux of a lot of very good things that are happening in the Twin Cities right now. But I really want to rave about this event. I got to do a Q&A with Anthony Taylor, who's not only a partner in Venture Bikes, which is an amazing space. If you're in the Twin Cities, you have got to go check it out. But Anthony also founded Slow Roll MSP, and I'll leave a link down in the description, but my understanding is he started Slow Roll MSP partly because, like a lot of places, the bike scene in the Twin Cities can be kind of melanin challenged. And Slow Roll, a movement that originated in Detroit from what I understand, has been effective at changing that dynamic. Anyway, hundreds of people showed up at Venture to talk cities and transportation, meet new people, and mostly partake in a massive slow roll ride that took us all over central Minneapolis. We slow rolled the heart of the Midtown Greenway. We slow rolled multiple lakes right as the sun was going down. Very spectacular. I got to talk to all kinds of folks as we made our circuit. The ride volunteers were experts at corking intersections and defusing potential conflicts with drivers, since we were rolling through tons of signals at low speed, a few hundred strong. We took over Nicollet Mall, which was extremely cool. Did our best not to delay the buses that used the mall. Didn't try to cork the trains, that probably wouldn't have ended well. Anyway, amazing event, and thanks to Anthony, everyone at Venture Bikes, Dreamland Culinary Heritage, which put together a fantastic post-ride meal, and all the folks at Our Streets, streets.mn, the Bicycle Alliance of Minnesota, and everyone else who helped put the event on. I'd like to say we should do this in other cities, but I honestly don't know if any other city can top this. Just very memorable. Let's talk more about Our Streets Minneapolis. So when the grant awards for President Biden's Reconnecting Communities program got announced on March 13th this year, nearly all the money went to public agencies like state and city DOTs, which makes sense. They are the implementers after all. But a couple grants actually went to nonprofit advocacy organizations, and one of those was a $1.6 million grant to Our Streets for a project called Bring Back 6th, reconnecting, restoring, and revitalizing the 6th Avenue North Corridor. Now, in transportation consulting, you always pay very close attention to these grant programs because that's where the RFPs are going to be coming from. And it is really hard to write a competitive grant application as a city, much less as a nonprofit. And it's almost unheard of for an organization like Our Streets to get a federal grant of this size. So extremely impressive, and I wanted to go to the location of the former 6th Avenue, now Olson Memorial Highway, to understand what Our Streets was getting themselves into. And while this was also listed on CNU's Freeways Without Futures list, the segment of interest is more of a strode that carved up and divided neighborhoods. One interesting thing to note, the highway was recently even worse than what it is now. 3 travel lanes in each direction, and there's now paint and delineators to create better separation for pedestrians, shorten the roadway crossings, and tighten up some of the turning radii. There are newish looking ADA ramps at some locations, although no marked crossings, which I think is what you do when you want to make it possible for people to cross, but you don't really want to encourage it. I kind of get it, but it's a clear symptom of a problem. A roadway design like this encourages speeds that are just not compatible at all with the residential context on either side. Anyway, the state DOT is looking for input on this stretch of roadway too, and I think our streets is going to give them all the input they can handle. The reason I say this is because our streets has already gone to work on I-94, and I think that's an understatement. They published this report, Reimagining I-94, in March of this year, and I'm not going to regurgitate everything in the report, but I strongly encourage people to have a close look, especially if you're in the Twin Cities, but even if you aren't, it can really give you a playbook for what it takes to articulate a compelling vision for the future, and it's backed up by good political and technical arguments. Oh, and thanks to R Streets for giving me permission to use some materials from this project. I can be a bit of a loose cannon, so nothing I say here is meant to represent the views of R Streets. Just go read the report for yourself. It's got all kinds of renderings to really help you visualize what the footprint of I-94 could become. But one thing they did here that is very cool and nerdy is they had their consultant, I imagine, use anonymized location services data, among other things, to analyze how I-94 is currently being used. And they found that while lots of regional and long distance trips, you know, the ones that are maybe appropriate for freeways, use I-694, which is the outer loop freeway to the north, the trips drivers use this segment of I-94 to make are usually short and mostly begin and finish within a mile of the segment. In other words, I-94 is mostly used for trips that could easily be made on the surface roadway network, or honestly, by transit or another mode in a lot of cases. I actually like the way they put it in the report. I-94 is used because it exists, not because it is necessary. Honestly, pretty evergreen statement. I mean, you could bulldoze a new freeway through the inner city neighborhoods of just about any city in the country, and yeah, people would use it, but the fact that people would use it doesn't make it a good idea. Okay, let's go to our final stop on this tour of beautiful Interstate 94. And we're going to where the freeway was constructed to run dead center through what, prior to that time, was the Rondo neighborhood. Just to give you an idea, here's a figure from one of the studies that the state DOT is doing as part of Rethinking I-94, showing where black people lived in St. Paul in 1930. And by the 1950s, 85% of St. Paul's black population lived in Rondo. And a block or two off the freeway, you can really get a sense of what the neighborhood used to be. If this was slum clearance, then the freeway builders have a very, very strange definition of that word. But towards the freeway, Old Rondo Avenue, the heart of the neighborhood, is just a frontage road now, and looking to either side of I-94 here is almost surreal. You see what appear to be normal, everyday neighborhood streets. It's just where there should be an entire string of additional city blocks with human-scaled streets. There's a gaping canyon with thousands of cars roaring through, expelling clouds of toxic exhaust and particulate matter. To be fair, there is some acknowledgement on the part of the DOT about the horrible wrongs that were done to this particular location, but acknowledgement isn't the same as repair. This is the Rondo Commemorative Plaza, which overlooks I-94 at North Fisk Street. And if you go there, which is highly recommended, you will learn a lot about the history of this place. It was a working class neighborhood, close into all the jobs in downtown St. Paul and other employment and commercial centers too. In other words, exactly the kind of place we'd hope people would be able to live affordably. But like nearly every city in the US, the Federal Housing Administration declared majority black areas hazardous and high risk, feeding a self-perpetuating cycle where condemnation and demolition to make space for a freeway ends up being a logical outcome. And I've been using the segregation by design animation to show all this, but the commemorative plaza makes it even more stark, showing the literal path of destruction, property by property. This isn't abstract. These aren't just lines on a map, but places where people lived and worked and did their shopping and dining and formed social ties with others in a cohesive neighborhood. The actual list of all the properties that were destroyed really drives home the sheer amount of harm and injustice that was done here, and that to this day hasn't been corrected. If I-94 didn't already exist today, given everything we know about the harms freeways cause in terms of asthma, carcinogens, sedentary behavior, terrible connectivity, institutionalized racism, everything I've talked about in this video, I have to believe you would not build I-94 today. There are just much better ideas out there. Ideas that can make our cities healthier, happier, more prosperous, and more equitable. And I would just humbly suggest that we do those things instead. And that's all I've got. Thanks for joining today, and thanks as always to the patrons for your direct support, which gives me the time and latitude to travel and explore all the interesting and unique things that are happening in cities all over the country and what we can learn from them. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode next week, and I'll see you then.